When I studied jazz in school, my teachers pushed me to be innovative, to break convention, and to push boundaries in order to be original. So no wonder I found it confusing when some of the same teachers simultaneously pushed us to follow the rules, imitate others, and follow tradition. My classmates reacted differently to this conflicting advice. Some chose to passionately conform to tradition, while others passionately rejected it, while others decided to pick and choose when to follow and when to break it. 20 years later, I'd like to share how I've dealt with that conflicting advice and how it's helped me create original music. I'll share this through a discussion on how creativity functions when subjected to constraints or rules versus how creativity functions subjected to freedom. Throughout this presentation, we will look into some key questions like, do rules stifle creativity or do they enable it? And do rules help or hinder originality? Following that, I'll demonstrate how my answers to those questions were used to build a new piece of music. Oh, hey, David Braid here. Welcome to my virtual classroom. Thanks for being here. Assisting me today is a new student who's late. Where is he on this list? Noah. His name's Noah. Yeah, Noah Tall. Hopefully he'll be along soon, but in the meantime, let's just get started with a discussion on originality in the context of music creation. Back to my old classmates reacting strongly for or against tradition, or somewhere in between. There were two exceptionally creative classmates who really excited their audiences by the originality presented in their graduation recitals. The first classmate played an impressive concert of original jazz quintet music. But the second classmate had his instrument on the floor for most of the recital while he kind of directed a spectacular show that culminated with a magician appearing on stage, turning my classmate into a gorilla. Recalling how we were all pushed as students to both break and conform to tradition, I wondered which of the two recitals truly displayed more originality. That's so easy. The one with the gorillas. Awesome. I see Noah has arrived. Please have a seat, Noah. We are just about to dig at the word originality. This is a word that can identify novelty. But look how the word contains a smaller word, origin. And this hints to us that perhaps originality isn't in a vacuum, like an expression of novelty for novelty's sake. It's flowing from somewhere, maybe somewhere complex, such as flowing from some kind of tradition. If musical originality flows from a tradition, look at the film composer John Williams, who wrote the orchestra scores for Star Wars, right? His music flows from the tradition of the late Romantic era before him. No one celebrates him for originality as they do with like Stravinsky, who's awesome. There must be more to it. Whoa, slow down, Noah. Maybe we can think of it this way. What if originality occurs when some composers, like Stravinsky, take a certain amount of familiar musical materials from the tradition and reorder them in a surprising and pleasing new way? Here's a non-musical example of this kind of reordering of familiar materials. The iPhone was technology of stunning originality back in 2007 before smartphones were common. The iPhone 1 arose from origins in other technologies such as computers, telephones, cameras, even Walkmans, among other things. What is a Walkman? Don't worry about that. The important point is an inventor surveyed the traditional technologies available to him and then reordered or combined them in a surprising and pleasing new way. Yeah, I knew that when I was 1 year old. But how does this help me as a composer? Just tell me how to be more creative. Right. We'll get to that. Okay, well, if you'd like to talk about creativity, let's take a look at what happens to it when it's subjected to constraints or rules, and let's compare that to what happens to creativity when placed in freedom. This class is a joke. I can summarize that in one sentence. Rules restrict us, right? Rules limit our potential, right? Rules are made up by a bunch of people who aren't even here, right? Breaking free from these oppressive rules liberates our creativity. Well, Noah, you've cut right to a central question. Do rules or constraints restrict creativity? Well, let's look into that question by considering two hypothetical contracts to compose a piece of music. one given to composer A and the other to composer Z. Pay attention to the different terms in each contract. Composer A's contract specifies that the music must be written for string quartet at a grade 8 RCM level. This 4-minute work breaks into 4 movements, each referencing one central Canadian folk song. The deadline is in 3 months, and there will be one 60-minute rehearsal before the premiere. By comparison, composer Z's contract provides neither a limit to the composition's length nor the number of players involved. It states that any musical instrument from any culture is available at the composer's request. There is no recommendation for musical style, and the composer can set the deadline as well as the rehearsals as well as the budget. In other words, composer Z's contract is essentially boundless. Now forget about if it's the contract with restraints or without restraints that sounds more interesting to you, because I want you to focus specifically on creativity. Which of the two contracts enables you to imagine some aspects of the music? Now, being able to pre-imagine some aspects of the music, either sonically, intellectually, visually, or a combination of all those things, means that your creativity has already initialized. So I'm asking you to observe your own creative thought as you consider each contract. Is it the contract with or without limitations that immediately creates a kind of foundation for you to begin building the composition? Fair enough, composer A's contract initializes creativity because the constraints define a way forward. But composer Z is paralyzed by the freedom in abundant choice. Sure, but that's a pretty extreme example, so you still haven't convinced me of anything. All right, let's look at this in real time. Here's an exercise I've done in workshops to demonstrate how creativity reacts to constraints versus freedom. Anyone can try this. Noah, do you have a pen? Yes, Captain, my captain. Just come down from that desk, please. Okay, I've asked our camera person to zoom in on the tip of that pen. It's a quill? The tip of the quill will be our window into creativity by observing it on video after the following 2 prompts. Noah, get ready to draw and wait for my prompt. Yes, Captain. All right, ready? Draw a picture. Okay, stop. Lovely. Now, turn the page over and get ready to draw after the next prompt. Ready? Draw a house in less than 10 seconds. Okay, stop. Okay, I gave you 2 prompts. The first was just to start drawing, but the second provided both structure and a time limit. Let's just watch the first 3 seconds of each video in slow motion, focusing on the movement of the pen tip. And the other? So you see that... Yeah, I'm not an idiot. Obviously the prompt with instructions constraints. Whatever. The clear instructions sent my pen into action. That's the point. And the prompt with vague instructions made me hesitate and doodle kind of randomly. Yes, the slow motion playback really magnifies that point, that creativity is born in constraints and immobilized by freedom. The rules or limitations or instructions, as you called them, actually become the foundation of creativity. This was so counterintuitive to me when I was a student. Yeah, that's nice. I understand all that, but if we embrace the rules forever, we just draw square houses all the time, or regurgitate the past, and there would be no real innovation. There would be no Mozart or no Miles Davis. Those great artists and others break rules. They break tradition, push the music forward. Again, Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring. Again, you've cut right to another key question. How do great composers embrace rules or tradition without becoming slaves to them? Now, I'll respond to that with respect to Stravinsky in a moment. Yeah, nice dodge. No, let's connect your point to what we were talking about with respect to constraints and creativity. How do rules ignite creativity and original ideas? Well, I'm going to demonstrate the answer by unraveling how I composed the genre bending classical quartet of my own called Great Bear River Blues. I'll specifically illuminate how I generated original style, melody, harmony, and rhythm from a generic and possibly touchy subject of Canada's Northwest Territories. Are you kidding? Generic? I grew up in the Northwest Territories. How could you possibly write anything of authority about my home? You're a from Toronto, right? Have you ever been to the Northwest Territories? Do you know anyone in the Northwest Territories? Do you know any history of the Northwest Territories? I didn't think so. And don't be ridiculous. Creation of original style? You're Canadian. Whoa. Well, by original style, I just mean a novel ordering of traditional harmony, melody, rhythm, form, and then by that definition, like any piece of bad music is oh so original. And that undermines composers who are actually truly original and good, like Stravinsky. He was a real innovator, a real rebel who changed the course of classical music in the 20th century. Like, people rioted at the premiere of The Rite of Spring. That's freaking awesome. How many people riot at your shows? And that bassoon note that starts the piece, like, man, so cool. And that wasn't even like a standard note. And so high in the bassoon range, right? So what if Stravinsky listened to you and just followed the established rules of bassoon writing? You would have, like, ruined Stravinsky's career. Hang on, Noah. Let's catch our breath a bit. I think we can discuss this opening to The Rite of Spring to make an example of shocking creativity that's still guided by musical materials of the past. So I'm glad you brought this up. We can kind of summarize a bunch of things we've talked about so far. So how revolutionary was that bassoon solo? First, not at all in terms of instrumental range. 100 years before the Rite, Carl Maria von Weber wrote much more challenging things for the bassoon to play in the same range as the opening to The Rite of Spring. And look here at the end of his first movement to his bassoon concerto. That high D even surpasses the opening note you mentioned. Now, Stravinsky studied with Rimsky-Korsakov, a master orchestrator. In fact, we still use that orchestrator's textbook today. Any Stravinsky score will show how well he wrote idiomatically for the instruments, including the bassoon. And ask a bassoonist, the opening solo to the Rite isn't considered so challenging among the existing repertoire before it, except for the fact that the solo commences a massive piece of music. The placing of that solo in bar 1 or at event 1 was extremely novel for that period. But how novel? Well, one of the most important modern pieces prior to the Rite was Debussy's Prelude to an Afternoon of a Faun, a striking composition of great interest to all modern composers of the day, certainly Stravinsky. Now let's listen to both openings back to back. Obviously very similar in dynamic, instrumental range, instrumental family, and even pitch. Maybe he was quoting Debussy. Maybe. Both begin with a held solo note in the woodwind family, and only a semitone apart. Stravinsky wasn't shy about being influenced by other composers either. He allegedly said, "A good composer doesn't imitate, he steals." We'll never know if Stravinsky actually stole this idea from Debussy, but certainly that bassoon solo wasn't novelty for novelty's sake. It appears in a distinct context of an introduction, as does Debussy's Prelude, pulling the listener into an evocative sound world, and without actually using any unorthodox woodwind technique. Yeah, but what about the rest of the Rite? The harmonies are just so random and non-conforming. If it's all just a Debussy ripoff, why did people riot at the first show? I didn't say all of Stravinsky is a Debussy ripoff. And regarding the riots, they weren't actually so directed at Stravinsky. The conflict was internal within the audience, with some listeners passionately supporting the new work, while others passionately rejected it. In fact, the audience's conflict over tradition reminded me of the same debate my classmates and I had following our colleague turning into a gorilla during his recital. And lucky for you, Noah, Stravinsky isn't here to destroy your critique that some aspects of his music are random. Just listen to his words here about the constraints he puts on his own music. Quote, "My freedom consists in my moving about within the narrow frame that I have assigned myself. I shall go even further. My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action, and the more I surround myself with obstacles or constraints. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit." He also said, quote, "The quality of being revolutionary is generally attributed to artists in our day with laudatory intent, undoubtedly because we are living in a period when revolution enjoys a kind of prestige among yesterday's elite." Well, he just didn't like being called an anti-establishment. Big deal. But the truth is, his music doesn't sound like anyone else's. He just broke all the rules. Well, we did just look at how Rimsky-Korsakov and Debussy may have influenced him. But please just take my copy of this book, Poetics of Music, and read more of Stravinsky's explanation of his own works in his own words. For now, just try and listen on, but I'm not trying to be dismissive of your confusion around this, because when I was a student, I used to... I'm not confused, you're confused. No, you were late, so you missed me talking about getting confused as a student receiving conflicting advice from teachers I admired. They said, follow the rules, follow tradition. But they also said, break rules, break the tradition. I was a trusting and open-minded student, so I wondered how I could solve the contradiction of simultaneously following and not following. Yeah, good luck with that. And after grappling with that for the past 20 years of performing and composing, here are 2 ways I've resolved that conflict. The first is a visual way to sort it out. Imagine a box on a page. Now, drawing a box requires rules. 4 equal sides. Now, drawing inside that box represents creativity that occurs inside the rules, and drawing outside the box is creativity based on the negative form of being inside the rules. In both cases, the rules define the position of the creative act as either occurring inside or outside. In other words, you can't go outside the box until you've first defined the rules that set the boundaries where the box actually exists. So perhaps my teachers were encouraging me to learn to draw the box as well as experience drawing both inside and outside it. Right. Okay, well, here's the second way. Take the word tradition. Tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Interesting thought. Perhaps there are more definitions of tradition than people think. In fact, here are 2 more definitions of tradition, or rather, 2 different kinds of tradition. There's tradition with a small t and tradition with a capital T. I'll quickly explain the difference using hockey as an example. The big T tradition of hockey, capital T, is defined by the rules that distinguish this game from all other sports. When you start changing those big T rules, the game lessens its resemblance to hockey. Now, within hockey, there are ways of playing the game, and these are changeable without altering the entire sport. For example, how to best hold a hockey stick, or how to focus a wrist shot or skate backwards. These small T traditions, or rules or techniques, are passed down from coach to player over time. However, Certain great hockey players come along with new techniques that advance the small t tradition. In hockey, no rebellious player has come along to overthrow the use of sticks or nets or pucks. Sports players have kept innovation within the proper domain as to not overthrow the laws of the game. Noah, you're actually sitting properly in your chair. This is good stuff. I can see how people will get this multi-definition of tradition kind of, mixed up. Yes, I totally get that. When I was a student, I also conflated both types of tradition, both big T and small t, to mean the same thing. Years later, I figured out that my teachers weren't pushing me to break the big T tradition, the fundamental laws that define music. No, it was to limit innovation within the small t tradition. So I recommend you discover what the constitutional laws of music are, specifically the timeless shaping forces of music, and refer to this as capital T tradition. And experiment with the small t tradition, which I recommend you just rename as convention. One more time, because this is the main point. Capital T tradition is a collection of fundamental laws that distinguish music from chaos. These laws express themselves through constantly evolving conventions that anyone may attempt to innovate or reorder. And if you happen to reorder them in a particularly surprising and pleasing way, your work may be appreciated or even celebrated for its originality. Okay, Noah, that's a lot of info there. So for the rest of today's lecture, please relax and enjoy this final presentation. It's a video from October 2019 that I made while I was on the road to illuminate my genre-bending classical quartet inspired by the Northwest Territories. I haven't forgotten how you took issue with me writing about your home where I've never been before. So the video will explain how constraints derived from the composition subject, the Great Bear River, enabled creativity to organize melody, harmony, rhythm, form, and style. This final presentation is kind of like a nice summary of everything we've talked about today. And at the very end, you'll see a live performance of the 4-minute piece. So, please enjoy. I'm saying hello to you from a small village in northern Finland. In fact, I'm just as far north here as you are in Yellowknife. And since I can't be there, I made this little video to tell you about a piece of music I wrote and specifically how it relates to the Northwest Territories. But there's a big problem. I've never been there before and couldn't get there in time. Yet I had to write a piece of music associated with it. Something about this seems wrong, because there's no way for me to write music representative of history, culture, or land. So the music I wrote has nothing to do with complex topics like that. Instead, I will tell you about my creative strategy building this music, and you'll find out how my piece connects to an image of a specific natural phenomenon that instantly ignited my musical creativity. So what was this creative strategy? Well, here's how I got started. To spark my imagination, I set out to find a photograph of something in the Northwest Territories that has an interesting visual pattern. I spent several hours scrolling through hundreds of online images when suddenly something caught my eye. It was a very striking zigzag pattern of water, so unusual that it didn't even look real. I discovered I was looking at an aerial view of the Great Bear River, situated in the Sahtu region of the Northwest Territories. The river is both short and bold. My musical piece also needed to be short, and I wished it to have a bold quality in order to distinguish itself within a long set of other pieces. The instant I saw the Great Bear River, I sensed the possibility of a whole piece of music governed by sudden directional shifts of forward-flowing energy, just like this river. In addition to its flow and shape, I was also attracted to the term Great Bear. This gave me the emotional feeling that I could best describe as a great force of energy, perhaps of mystical origin, with a mind all of its own. I also thought about the musicians I was composing for and how this kind of energy could flow through them while performing the piece. Their long hair would become like the flowing water. So that's how the Great Bear River helped me characterize both the form and the soul of my piece. But that's still not enough information to build music. How should I create the melodies, the harmonies, and the rhythms? Well, this part of my strategy is actually really boring. I simply dug up more geographical data about the Great Bear River and used those numbers to build my main theme. Something like this. The Great Bear River is 113 kilometers long. So if I translate 113 into a musical language that you may recognize, like do, re, mi as 1, 2, 3, then 113 becomes do, do, mi. I decided to put this first do up one position higher on the piano, and I ended up lowering the sound of the mi note a little so it sounds a bit like the blues, but you'll find out later why I did that. But this little melody of do, do, mi became like the common Lego block that I used to build most of the melodies throughout the piece. Now, what about harmony? Again, more boring stuff. I looked for more numbers, this time from the river's only settlement, a small village called Toledo. I used Toledo's geographical coordinates to build a pattern of notes, like this. Did you like that? Well, I did because I never heard it before, and being a composer is kind of like being a musical explorer searching for interesting new sounds. I also liked how the flow of notes had a zigzag pattern along the white and black piano keys, not unlike the aerial view of the Great Bear River. The other thing I liked is by sounding some of these notes together, they created crazy chords with special dissonances that want to flow towards resolution, just like gravity that pulls water through those curves along that river. Also, these dissonances resemble jazz dissonances familiar to me as a jazz improviser. So with a design method for melody and harmony, I wondered about style and rhythm. There doesn't seem to be extensive information written online about folk music style in the Northwest Territories. However, I did read about a folk music associated with the Dene people, characterized by driving pulse, syncopation, and vocalizations which use sounds that, to my ear, have some similarities to blues calls. Since the river motif of my piece would require driving pulse and syncopation already, I decided to keep going and just stylize my piece a little bit with the blues, such as taking the do-do-mi motif, which I talked about before, or 1-1-3, and flattening the 3 or the mi. I also used bending notes typical of blues, and I made a more distinctive title for the piece, Great Bear River Blues, which not only sounds like fun, but when spoken, forms the foundational rhythm to the music, Great Bear River Blues, which looks like this in rhythmic notation. And after given some harmony, sounds like this. And then something amazing happened. I was reading more about Toledo, the settlement which derived the harmony to my piece, and I was delighted to learn that one of the most prolific composers of Dene music was born there in 1879 by the name of Yatsule. This connection confirmed to me, at least emotionally, that I was on a meaningful path. I guess there might be some connection or inspiration that the Great Bear River gave to this Toledo-born composer's music. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. But at the very least, this discovery gave me the final boost of creative energy to finish writing my music, staying true to the course that I was on.